Good afternoon, Anthony. Today we'll be venturing into a new topic, namely, why is Taylor Swift so popular? And I see this as part one. There are probably 20 different themes one could explore to understand this incredible Swiftie phenomenon. I looked on the weekend. She has 282 million Instagram followers. And if one considers that not every Taylor Swift fan is an Instagram member or follower, it's likely that she has 5 to 10 times that number of fans. So let's just round numbers up. Call it 300 million Instagram followers. If the factor is 5 to work out how many fans she has, that's 1.5 billion people. If the factor is 10, which it could easily be, according to some internet searches, then she has 3 billion fans. That's getting close to half the world. The world's population admires, enjoys Taylor Swift. That is a phenomenon worth understanding. If for anyone interested in human societies, human biology, human psychology, we need to understand why Taylor Swift appeals to half the planet. And we've discussed this at length, and numerous factors have come to mind. But for part one, the topic of empathy seems appropriate, and I'm looking forward to analyzing this with you through the lens of a zoologist. I think we need to look at other primates, other animals, to understand empathy and to form a view as to whether part of the Taylor Swift phenomenon is related to our ability to empathize. Does that sound like a good place to start?
It certainly does, and it's a wonderful new frontier for a website called, or at least a YouTube channel called Exploring the BioEdge, because I guess it's a little unconventional to view humans so much as part of the frontier of the natural world. But it is indeed true that our own species is to us one of the most mysterious things. I mean, the mystery starts right in the mirror. And so one can't go past this astonishing popularity of a single woman who is, in some sense, a modern monarch, particularly because you don't see that much political commentary about her. There's a lot of commentary on YouTube about politics, but people seem so flummoxed about Taylor Swift that neither the biologists like us nor the political commentators seem to be able to get a kind of a grasp on what's going on. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think she got involved in the 2020 election and supported Biden, but I think she's generally steered away from politics. I don't think she's made any commentary on this upcoming election. So, yes, it seems to be the fan base, I think, is not one side or the other of the political spectrum. Yes, I agree.
Well, that makes it all the more appropriate a topic for us, because here at the BioEdge, we're mainly biologically oriented. We're not politically oriented. And so we have this marvelous opportunity with Taylor Swift to try to interpret her biologically without risking our opinion being dismissed by one political side or the other, because in this context, we're completely neutral. We're just genuinely interested in what it is about human biology and society and psychology, all of which is broadly part of human biology, that has created this unprecedented phenomenon.
I couldn't agree more. And so, I was thinking that in very broad terms, there seems to be a shortage of empathy in the world right now. If one thinks of the awful wars taking place between nations and between cultures, in terms of the culture wars, that term I think everyone will understand. Empathy seems to be at a relative low, at a global human societal level, and the thought struck me that perhaps Taylor Swift is an antidote to that, and people are craving more empathy, this positive emotion. So, do you think I'm on the right track there?
Well, I think you are on the right track, particularly because you, unlike me, have actually attended a humongous Taylor Swift concert, and so you've actually experienced firsthand the kind of vibe that occurs in the queue waiting to enter, which can be an extensive queue over days rather than hours, and also the kind of camaraderie and bonhomie that goes on among apparently disparate sectors of society in that context, where suddenly the barriers are down and everybody is kind of open to being friends and bonding in a way.
Absolutely, yeah. It was quite a thing to experience. My two daughters were very excited for months on end with the thought of going to the Taylor Swift concert, and I had my expectations as to how enjoyable and interesting the concert would be, but the experience was way beyond anything I'd expected, particularly on this front. The moment I entered that queue 8 hours before the concert started, I was just engulfed with this positive vibe. Without exception, everyone was acting in a manner that indicated they were, on your side. They were your friend. They were swapping these things called friendship bracelets. Most Swifties make bracelets, and many have tens of them on their arms, each with a Taylor Swift song, the name of the song on the bracelet. And there's this routine whereby strangers swap these friendship bracelets, and that's something that Taylor promoted, I think, in one of his songs. But the friendship vibe was not only between the guests, the audience, but also the people controlling the queue, and there was just an incredibly happy spirit, and that's what got me thinking about this idea that, well, part of this phenomenon is just this positive friendship vibe that she seems to be able to create amongst an audience of 70,000 plus people.
Yes, it is indeed remarkable, and it's a heartening sign for those of us who've grown weary of the cynicism and, shall we say, the negativity of the modern times, because it's very easy watching developments over the last, say, 10 years in Western society to feel that we're in the Kali Yuga, the era of degradation and decline, and it's very easy to become despondent because so many moral and philosophical principles in Western society seem to have been discarded, and it's easy to think that there's no way to get them back. It seems almost like a hopeless task. But then out of the ether comes an inexplicable and mysterious figure like Taylor Swift, who I think has gone under the radar of many deep-thinking commentators because they simply don't know what to make of her. And so, I think for people who really want to understand the nature of the human species, this is a tremendous opportunity to think hard and accept that we're being presented with something that can teach us a great deal. But you see, it's a framing problem, because before you can think clearly about Taylor Swift, you have to know what kinds of questions to ask, and that's the hardest part, as it were.
Yeah. So, one of the other topics in a part 2, perhaps we can chat about virtue, because I think she does also advocate virtuous behavior by and large, but that's very complicated. She also seems to be injecting humor back into society, where perhaps humor and empathy have been stripped out, as you say, over the past decade or so. But let's leave humor and virtue. They can be aside for now and just focus on empathy. And yes, the framing of empathy, for many years I've been aware that other animals don't necessarily have empathy, and baboons being perhaps the best example. I learned from your readings that baboons are strange in lacking any empathy, and I think I fell into a trap 10 years ago of thinking, well, baboons are probably the norm for with regards to other. The baboon approach is the norm in mammals in general, and so that humans are perhaps unique in displaying empathy. And I've been thinking this through since standing in that Taylor Swift queue, trying to understand empathy in relation to the animal kingdom and how Taylor may be promoting empathy and how empathy evolved over time. So you have a far better grasp of empathy across the animal kingdom than I do, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, you see, to ground ourselves initially in a general view of empathy, it's difficult to be objective, you see, because I guess there are two kinds of authors out there on the topic of empathy in animals. One is the sort of default, less thoughtful author who simply assumes that because animals are not human, then we can more or less discount their empathy. That's the sort of historical view. Then there's a genre of authors who have actually investigated animals very closely in behavioral terms. People like Mark Bekoff and Frans de Waal, who have written very clearly about empathy and have taken the view that there's much more empathy out there than anybody might have suspected. But you see, even in their case, one has to suspect bias because it's very difficult to be objective. Once a particular researcher particular direction of favoring a view of empathy in animals, it's very easy to dwell on certain anecdotes or certain aspects and become somewhat biased. Of course, it's a beneficial and positive bias because it's a joyous thing to discover empathy in animals. But the point I'm trying to make is we still lack an objective view of how much empathy there is among other animals in a full perspective. But what we do know is that some unlikely candidates do have remarkable empathy, and I guess the rodents are the preeminent examples because the laboratory rat and the laboratory mouse, Rattus norvegicus and Mus musculus, are surprisingly empathetic, given that we see them as pestilent rodents, and also given that their brain size, as measured by the encephalization quotient, is remarkably limited. So the normal average brain size for a mammal in terms of the encephalization quotient is a 1. And the higher the number, the more brainy the animal, and the lower the number below 1, the less brainy the animal. And by most analyses, rats and mice have an encephalization quotient of only about 0.5, which means they're only about half as brainly as one would expect them to be for an average mammal. And yet they show so many signs of a complex social life that they seem almost human in some ways. And they shame us, in terms of how cruelly we treat them in laboratory situations, because we do all these cruel experiments on them to see how empathetic they are. And it almost seems like they turn out to be more empathetic than the laboratory scientists who torture them in search of their empathy. So right there, right there, we've got a mystery that has yet to be resolved. How can it possibly be that rats and mice are among the more empathetic animals out there? Indeed, this is a fairly far-fetched statement, but if you read the literature on empathy in laboratory rats and mice, and then you compare that behavioral profile with some very good, detailed and scholarly books that have been written about the society of baboons in several different study areas in Africa, it's difficult not to come out with the impression that the baboon is far less empathetic than rats and mice, even though we see the baboon as fairly close to us in the evolutionary tree. So already there you've got two mysteries. The first mystery is, how can it possibly be that an animal as closely related to us, an anthropoid primate, well, shall we say a higher primate, a cercopithecoid primate in the form of several genera of baboons, can seem almost psychopathic from our point of view, in the sense that it seems to lack empathy completely. Whereas lowly rodents that we regard, basically as vermin, and we poison horribly, cruelly, and we don't really regard as being worthy of any kind of empathy from our side, turn out to be almost on a par with us in terms of empathy. Very strange indeed.
Yes. And it seems like most other animals have empathy as part of their biology, from lemurs to chimpanzees to, as you say, rats and mice, but also even birds like sparrows. In the literature, there are articles suggesting that experiments have shown that sparrows show empathy. And perhaps we should give some examples of the behavior that exhibit this empathy for the listeners.
Yes, well, the sorts of behaviors that have been reported in experiments, particularly on captive animals, are experiments that reveal a kind of an altruistic tendency. So, for example, in the Diana monkey, there was an experiment in which there was a kind of a gadget that if you fiddled with certain cards, then it would yield an edible reward. And in that experiment, one individual in the captive group was a bit dumb and couldn't figure out how to use the cards, and another individual basically did the card for her and then let her take the treat. So that's a very clear indication of empathy and altruism. And similarly, it's been observed in captive colonies of the chimpanzee, Pan troglodytes, that there's quite a lot of empathy in the chimpanzee, even relative to other species. So, for example, in one situation, a certain group of chimpanzees in captivity were able to witness an accident involving a monkey, and they were closely observed to flinch and to gasp and to give every sign that they were empathizing with the monkey as it fell into a net for capture. And similarly with the orangutan, there's a well-described example where a captive orangutan was so compassionate and empathetic with a crippled starling in its cage that it tried several times to get the starling to fly by throwing it into the air, eventually climbing to the tallest point in its enclosure and carefully opening the wings of the starling and then throwing it into the air, whereupon the starling bombed again and landed on the ground, and then this particular orangutan individual sat with it for some time. And when people came back the next day, the starling was gone, so the care seemed to have worked. So it's very difficult to understand. It's difficult to report such incidents without coming to the conclusion that orangutans and chimpanzees have pretty much the same levels of empathy that we do. Of course, they also have a darker side. They wage war. They can be cruel. Chimpanzees, when they hunt monkeys for meat, will cheerfully consume them alive without any regard for the suffering and cruelty. So nobody's pretending that a chimpanzee or an orangutan is an angel, but then we aren't either. And so, Frans de Waal, Mark Bekoff, and such authors, I think they've come to the conclusion that while empathy in great apes is far from perfect. It's pretty much on a par with us. And in fact, as I think you mentioned to me earlier today, it's tempting to turn it on its head and to consider the possibility that we humans, Homo sapiens, are actually, in the scheme of things, in the scheme of, shall we say, higher mammals, the least empathetic, because we have a capacity for deceit, corruption, warfare, destruction, cruelty, and other ills that is not matched by any comparable mammals. So perhaps we are, in some sense, in some kind of context, among the less empathetic mammals out there. I'm not putting us in the same category as baboons, because what listeners have to understand is that detailed field studies of baboons, in which the authors had no axe to grind. I mean, they loved baboons. They would never portray baboons as quasi-psychopathic unless it was actually true. Researchers who followed baboons, for example, in the Okavango swamps in Botswana for years on end, noting their every move. Baboons are astonishingly unlike us. For example, a mother baboon will never categorically ever feed its young anything other than, the breastfeeding. And that's amazing because baboons have these magnificent cheek pouches in which they can stuff whole fistfuls of seeds and other foods for later consumption. And of course, baboons have a hand, that can grasp things. And so there would be nothing easier in principle than for a mother to get some food out of her food pouch in her cheeks and then give it to her young. But no such feeding has ever been recorded. Baboons just simply don't feed their young beyond the lactation stage. They also don't teach their young anything. In general, baboons never teach each other anything. And they don't really make intelligent eye contact. They don't communicate with their eyes in the way we do. And so they live in this dark world where there's no real compassion or sharing or teaching or giving. There's no generosity. And baboons are amazing because even in the case of a youngster who breaks its arm visibly, the arm dangling, as it were, after the bone being broken, the mother, this has been reported again and again, the mother makes no concession. So the mother doesn't treat the youngster any differently from a youngster that has not broken its arm. It's just basically, life as usual. And if the youngster makes it, it makes it. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And there's no there doesn't seem to be any recognition on the part of the mother that the juvenile requires any special care. So it's very difficult to understand the mind of a baboon, even given the sort of minimal expectations of empathy that we know from our own species.
Yeah, and where is that the compassion one would expect with a juvenile with a broken arm does occur in other species, from lemurs to chimps to other monkeys?
Yes. I mean, it may be simple or rudimentary from our human intellectual point of view, but yes, that kind of compassion has been recorded and should be expected in any higher animal that has a relatively complex society. So the way it seems from several really authoritative studies on baboons is that they are remarkable among mammals and among primates for their lack of empathy, almost as if there's some mysterious ecological specialization, some mysterious aspect of their basic niche in the world that has led them to abandon the empathy that was already present in their own ancestors. So that's one of the biggest adaptive questions of baboons: is what is it about their niche that has led them to specialize on a lack of empathy, which is true even relative to their closest counterparts in Asia, the macaques. So there's a genus Macaca in the southern parts of Asia, which is the closest Eurasian thing to a baboon, but those monkeys are not quite as devoid of empathy as the baboons are, which are restricted to Africa. So it's a big mystery, and we lack a satisfactory context or framing to evaluate such mysteries.
So we're trying to understand empathy in human societies, where it came from and how Taylor Swift may be promoting it and how it may link to her popularity. But I think understanding the lack of empathy in baboons is one useful way to get a better grip on how empathy works in human society. So if we can go into the baboons a bit more, I find it puzzling, and I'm sure most biologists do, as to why empathy wouldn't be adaptive in a social species, because surely the empathy in rats and mice and sparrows and lemurs and chimpanzees and orangutans is in essence a social glue that assists that species through time to survive, survival of the fittest. And those with more effective social glue are going to do better than groups without that glue, or individuals without that glue. So how can the baboon come to be the exception, given how social it is? That's a mystery to me. Do you have any theories on that, or did any of the authors, the researchers, have theories as to how that could be adaptive?
No, nobody, including myself, has really crossed that threshold into any kind of coherent idea. I mean, it's really remarkable. I mean, baboons are so quasi-psychopathic that they don't even play as adults, which is amazing considering, how brainier they are. I mean, baboons are in the same kind of ballpark in terms of their relative brain size as chimpanzees. Yeah. Baboons and chimpanzees are far more similar in their encephalization quotient, in other words, in their relative braininess to body size, than either of them is to us. It's not the case that a baboon is a stupid monkey, whereas a chimpanzee is a clever ape. They're more or less the same in terms of brain size. Yeah. But baboons are so lacking in what we would consider, human qualities, that they don't even play. I mean, the youngsters play, but even in the youngsters, it's dubious that there's any kind of compassion or empathy going on in play behavior. There's a lot of rambunctious play behavior that may or may not contain any empathy, because certainly in the domestic dog, it's very obvious that dogs play empathetically. They have all kinds of gestures that indicate that they can view the play behavior from the point of view of the playmate. And when there's unfair or bullying behavior, then there are certain responses that indicate that there's a sense of fairness or morality, a rudimentary sense of fairness or morality in the domestic dog. But in baboons, it's not clear that the youngsters play with that kind of basis. And as soon as they become adult, all play behavior is gone, which is surprising given how smart they are. One expects a smart animal to continue to play in adulthood, and that's certainly true for many birds. For example, the psittaciform birds, like certain cockatoos. I have them here around my suburb in large numbers, and adult cockatoos playing all the time. Crows do the same thing. There's all sorts of play behaviors. They love to play as adults, and so, of course, so do humans. And so, in all kinds of different ways, baboons just are remarkably different from us. And another aspect of that is that various monkeys around the world have been drafted, often in a cruel and exploitative way, into service for humans. Like, for example, the capuchin monkeys in South America have become organ grinder monkeys, and in Asia, a certain kind of macaque is used to climb coconut trees and harvest coconuts. So people can kind of draft monkeys into a sort of a slave mode, like an exploited pet. But nobody's ever managed to do that with baboons. To keep a baboon in captivity is too cruel to contemplate. You can chain it up to a pole and you can subjugate it, but nothing good ever comes out of it. Not even a rudimentary collaboration. They're just completely, they're absolutely in a category that is beyond, that defies any kind of attempts to domesticate them. If you think about it, if baboons were different, considering the long history that we humans have had with them, for example, in ancient Egypt, human civilizations have been in contact with baboons, particularly in Northeast Africa and and the Arabian Peninsula for anything up to 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And this is one of those dogs that's not barking. It's a search image that you don't think of until you frame it the right way. It's immediately surprising that nobody has domesticated baboons, because we've had every opportunity to do so, including in ancient Egypt, where the local baboon, the Hamadryas baboon, figured prominently in the kind of mythology of the ancient Egyptians. So they had it as a prominent figure in their mythology. And they tried to domesticate all kinds of things. The ancient Egyptians were attempting to domesticate gazelles and oryxes and so on. But nothing ever developed in that direction with baboons. And that is, in my view, because it is categorically impossible to go down that route with a baboon. It just doesn't respond in a way that allows that kind of interaction. So they are chalk and cheese different from us. And it's particularly amazing when you consider that baboons are intensely social. They have a tiered societal complexity in which there are smaller groups and then larger clans or coalitions. And ultimately, with many species, several species of baboons, you've got groups of hundreds that may congregate, for example, in a particular refuge at night. So there can be several hundred animals in this group, and they all know each other. What we know about baboons is that they're so observant of each other that they can recognize the call of an individual. They can hear a bark or a squeal somewhere in this crowd, and they know exactly which one it is. So it's not that they're unobservant socially. They're intensely observant. They all know who's who in the zoo. They all know the hierarchical status of every individual in a group of hundreds. They're absolutely on the ball with that. That's what their big brain is for. They've channeled all their intellectual or cognitive energy into being superbly aware of everybody in their extended group, in some cases up to hundreds of individuals. They can recognize them by sight. They can recognize them by sound. And despite that acute awareness, societal awareness, there's virtually no empathy. It's perfectly remarkable. And my basic question is, I've put your question to me was, how do you understand this in terms of the ecological niche of baboons? My answer is, it's almost like I've put that on a shelf as a special question that's waiting for me to fall into some happy circumstance where I can really address it. And I think the happy circumstance is not me sitting thinking with my chin on my fist in a room. It is some kind of discussion setting where several individuals who happen to have different perspectives on this problem all come together, and then the catalysis of discussion and an interchange of ideas will start this ball rolling. But at the moment, there's a complete block. I just have no idea what to say about it other than to acknowledge it as a reality.
Yeah, and it's in the too hard basket right now.
That's right. But just to harp a little more on the comparison between baboons and rats, I mean, it's particularly amazing that there's so much more empathy in rats than in baboons, considering that rats do not have a complex, gregarious society.
Mm.
I mean, yes, they certainly occur in numbers, but they don't have the kind of social hierarchical complexity and gregariousness that we see in baboons. Baboons are intensely gregarious animals. Their whole survival depends on gregariousness. But rats, not so much so. I mean, a Rattus norvegicus population living in some sewer in some city could probably exist perfectly well if there were just a few individuals. On the other hand, in another urban setting, there could be hundreds of individuals, but it's not as if we see rats as being socially complex in the same way as we see baboons. And yet, the chalk and cheese rats are more empathetic, as far as we know, than baboons are.
Right. So there's something about that intense social structure within the baboon society that favors a lack of empathy. Here's one idea, Anthony. Corporates in human economies, societies, and armies function largely without empathy as part of their protocols. They are in some sense fear-based institutions without the positive empathy side. As part of the instructions from above, as it were, the instructions are not be empathetic with one's peers, colleagues. There will be compassion and empathy amongst colleagues and soldiers, but that's not what is required for it to function.
Yes. Well, that does kind of spark a certain train of thought, because when you look at the ecology and biogeography of baboons in general, they are kind of odd among monkeys in combining an intensely predatory environment, namely, in a broad sense, the savannas and semi-deserts of Africa, with an unusually terrestrial mode. So, for example, the Chacma baboon in South Africa is the largest monkey on Earth, basically. It's also one of the most terrestrial monkeys, because that species, the Chacma baboon, can live essentially generation after generation in a situation where there are no trees to climb. It climbs rocks, but it's an intensely terrestrial animal, and so that makes it vulnerable to predators. There are many predators, diverse and large predators in its environment. Being fairly large, it breeds relatively slowly. And so you could possibly investigate a framing of baboons in which they are the large primates that are most under the gun from predatory pressure.
Right.
Partly because they live in Africa, and partly because they're more terrestrial even than the macaques are in Asia. So maybe there's something about that. It's something about the fact that baboons have strayed farther into the realms of an improbable existence for a primate. They've specialized on being right at the frontier of what a primate can do in terms of being terrestrial in an intensely predatory environment, and maybe something about that could explain their peculiar mentality, their peculiar combination of the dependence on gregariousness, but an abandonment of the empathy that was the default expectation in even their own ancestors.
Right. There was a brief gap there for me as our connection broke. I hope that wasn't the case for listeners. But are you suggesting that the baboon societies potentially operate more like a disciplined army in a human context, as opposed to I don't know, a Woodstock concert?
Well, maybe it's worth pondering that, but certainly, if so, it does not extend to the males being particularly protective on behalf of anyone else. For example, that's another big surprise with baboons. I mean, anybody who's watched baboons in a game reserve will know that the adult males have truly ferocious canine teeth, and they're also a lot bigger than females. Up to double the body mass, and so it's very easy to assume that when there's a threat from a predator such as a leopard, the adult males with their ferocious armaments will defend the rest of the group. But the evidence for that is ambivalent at best. Even when it comes to the male in question's own offspring, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of defense going on. So if there is that kind of military mentality in baboons, in the light of their extremely predatory predicament, then it doesn't manifest in a kind of a protective or defensive altruism. Essentially, adult male baboons who are the only members of the group that really have the size, strength, and teeth to stand off a leopard, they're basically looking out for number one. They're not really there to help anyone else.
Yeah, it's interesting to contemplate, switching back to humans, that there are baboon-like characters in amongst us. We have psychopaths in our populations, and they're often extremely competent individuals. Cruel and competent seems to go hand in hand with psychopaths. They often rise to the top of the institutions, big corporates, for example. So we seem to have, the empathy of much of the others in the animal kingdom, the rats, lemurs, chimpanzees, orangutans, etc. We have those traits, but we also have a lot of baboon traits in us. So we seem to be a bit of a blend, and maybe, when we understand why baboons are in essence psychopaths, we'll come to understand ourselves better.
Well, yes. I mean, one of the sort of ideas in explanation of the incidence of psychopaths in the human population is that in our evolutionary history there were military situations, inevitable military situations in which the psychopaths were just what you needed, because these were the people who could perform best in a military emergency. They just didn't have the same feelings as other people, and so they kind of paid for themselves. In normal peacetime, they're a weight on society because they're so destructive and so deceptive and so corrupt from the point of view of normal human morality. But it could be that overall they pay their own way, in the sense that they make all the difference between success and failure in a situation of warfare. So that's just one way to think about it. But yes, given that human beings are so often psychopathic, and that psychopathic humans can actually achieve quite a powerful position in our societies, just that fact alone should give researchers pause before jumping to the conclusion that we humans are obviously more empathic than any other comparable species. I mean, it could be that the psychopaths, although not a large percentage of the population, are so important in our overall species profile that they cause us to rank somewhat below where we think we rank in the scale of empathy among higher mammals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And here's a thought experiment. If we just vaporized all the psychopaths across the world in a rather psychopathic move, in our thought experiment, would our economies be less effective? Assuming that psychopaths are running many of the corporations and getting paid the tens of millions of dollars a year in salaries, are those corporations going to be less successful if they all disappeared?
Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I mean, there is such a thing as competition in nature. There's been this, I guess, this two-sided approach to viewing competition versus cooperation when looking at societies of animals, including humans. Some researchers tend to favor the competitive angle, and those tend to be males. Other researchers, often females, women, tend to favor the view that there's a lot of cooperation going on. But obviously both are happening.
Yeah.
And competition ultimately is cardinal in biology. So, to the degree that a species succeeds or fails on the basis of its competitive abilities, it could well be that the psychopaths among us are part of our success. It's not something we like to accept, because we have this idea that we are ethical, moral, and virtuous creatures. But I think, I guess what I would say is this: is that the incidence of psychopaths in the human species is in the same category of puzzles as the quasi-psychopathy of baboon species in general. They both present the same kind of conundrum.
So Yeah, I'm not sure whether you've read Robert Sapolsky's work, but he concluded that the leaders of the baboon troops in Kenya, the troops that he studied, were sometimes benign, popular leaders, and sometimes benevolent leaders, benign, benevolent. But sometimes the leader was a real nasty piece of work. And usually the nasty piece of work was taken out by the adult males below him. They would, the benevolent types would collaborate and take out the nasty one. So it's Robert Sapolsky is implying there that there would have been positive collaboration. I'm not sure whether you'd go so far as to say that there was empathy amongst these young males plotting to overthrow the nasty dominant male, but it hints towards compassion and empathy and positive emotions amongst some of the baboons, which contradicts, a lot of what we've been saying about the baboons in this call. It also, the thought pops to mind that, well, perhaps baboons are similar to us in some regards, with some psychopaths, but at least some individuals that can show some compassion.
Yes, well, in biology, nothing is black and white. So ultimately, of course, baboons have some features in common with us. And in the case of Robert Sapolsky's work, it's difficult to disentangle, the objective facts from his particular viewpoint. Yeah, this whole field of primatology is very difficult to do in a completely objective way. So I haven't really got a firm view on Robert Sapolsky's findings. I'm going more on other studies that were more focused on the kinds of things we're talking about today, because Robert Sapolsky was interested more in the kind of hormonal changes that go with variations in status within the group. He was coming at it from the sort of hormonal and physiological side more. Yeah. Whereas other scholars, other students of the behavior of baboons have been collecting data that's more central to the kinds of questions that we're asking. So basically, I don't know. Yeah. But we shouldn't expect an animal as complex as a baboon to be completely lacking in empathy. It's just that there's much less there than you would expect for such an animal.
Yeah. And when you say that they don't play, do you think we can stretch that to say they therefore have less humor than other primates? When other primates and animals like dogs are playing, do you think we could push it to say there's humor associated with play?
Well, from what I've read about baboons, they seem to have no humor as adults.
Yeah.
And you may say, well, which adults of which species have humor? Well, plenty. I mean, as I said, the psittaciform birds, the parrots, the cockatoos, and their ilk. There's lots of humor going on there.
The form of pranks.
Yes, yeah. And apparently even mice, I mean, I don't know how seriously to take this, but people who've studied the vocalizations of mice find that even mice laugh.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of evidence that humor is well beyond a purely human development.
Right.
Most of the things that we used to think are exclusive to us are no longer thought to be so. And humor is like that. So humor, curiosity, rudimentary morality, a sense of fairness, playfulness, all of these things are shared widely beyond humans with other higher animals. But in the case of perhaps somebody who knows baboons better than I do can correct us on this. But as far as I know, having read some of the books involved, baboons that just show no sense of humor at all as adults, and even when they play as rambunctious juveniles. There's a lot of monkeying around going on, but it's not clear to me that there's any humor going on.
Yeah,
you can play in a rambunctious way without necessarily having any sense of humor at all.
Absolutely. And in my experience, psychopaths don't have humor either. I think I've encountered a few over my career, and I didn't detect humor in them. And I think that's also in the books on psychopath. I've read a couple of them. It seems to be a characteristic. They're cruel and humorless. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I'd also I'm also recalling what you've told me about Taylor Swift, which is that one of her attractive aspects is that she not only has charisma, sex appeal, a kind of an ability to read the room and so on. She's also got quite a complex sense of humor and an engaging playfulness that is partly responsible for how popular she is.
Absolutely. I think she uses caricatures of various human types to express that humor. So she takes the various characters to extremes, and my sense is that she's playing with that. She's an actress.
Yes.
In fact, probably first and foremost, she's an actress, and she plays these different characters with extreme skill. But part of that playing is a playfulness into the realm of humor, which is just wonderful. And I think that may be one of the greatest appeals for people, because I think, the culture wars and the negativity that we discussed earlier in the podcast are associated with less humor. Humor seems to have, in many respects, been vaporized from debates and discussions over the last 10 years. The days of Monty Python are long gone, from what I can make out.
Yes, well, that's right. So anybody like a Taylor Swift who is kind of wrangling the culture wars and restoring some sense of humanity to large numbers of persons across the world is going to be able to restore empathy most efficiently by working with humor, because you could say that there's a kind of an empathy deficit in the Western world today that's manifest in the culture wars. But it would be equally to the point to say that there's a humor deficit. One overlaps with the other, but perhaps the humor deficit is the more remarkable, because we know that humans are capable of being cruel and waging warfare, and these things are all through history. But it seems more remarkable in a way to find ourselves in an essentially peaceful time in human history, where we seem for some peculiar reason to have lost our sense of humor. That's deeply puzzling and also deeply insidious. And so I think what we're saying is that if we wish to understand the Taylor Swift phenomenon, then something we should focus on with particular clarity is how she works with humor, and how healing and how restorative that kind of humorousness can be in the world today.
I couldn't agree more. Look forward to that being a part 2 of this series. And thanks so much for the insights, Anthony. I think we've got a long journey to go to explain why half the human population on the planet potentially is a Taylor Swift fan. There are also what my girls call haters. She seems to get people's backs up as well, and we can explore that strange part of this Taylor Swift phenomenon, that well, perhaps 3 billion support her, but they're a good number. I don't know if it's in the billions that dislike her. It's very strange that's the case. And of course, just to note, we haven't mentioned what how impressive her musical skills are. She's a singer. She writes her own songs, and she's a poet in many respects. So we haven't even touched on that, but we'll get to that in later parts, because I do think empathy and humor are perhaps even more important than her songwriting ability, her ability to sing, and her ability to dance. Those strike me as very impressive, of course, but lower order factors in terms of understanding the whole phenomenon. Would you agree?
Of course. Well, the way I would see it is that basically, you don't get anywhere close to as successful as Taylor Swift unless you have the basic skills of dancing, singing, sex appeal, and so on. So those things in themselves are not puzzling. We can kind of take them for granted and look at the more puzzling aspects, which is what is it about her that is appropriate to the modern time and has gone under the radar, such that it shines a light on some previously unsuspected aspect of human nature. And in this discussion, Anthony, you and I have not answered anything. I mean, some listeners may be frustrated because we haven't provided any answers. We've just skirted around with sort of contextual information about baboons and so on. But the point is, we don't know. But what we do know is that unless we start kind of refining our search image and the questions we're asking, we may never know. It could be that Taylor Swift will have come and gone and remained a mystery, and nobody will ever really have asked the right questions that could have shed light on this remarkable phenomenon. Because in some sense, she is the most remarkable person in the world right now, in the sense that she's certainly the most famous woman in the world. And the fact that she is a woman and pulling off the success that she is pulling off is, in a certain framing, the main question that has to be answered right now in the realm of public consciousness. So we'd encourage listeners to address this question head on. Really think about this, because Taylor Swift, whether you like her or not, whether you follow her or not, whether you have even heard her music or not, is indeed a very important person that deserves deep consideration. Would you agree, Anthony?
Couldn't agree more, Anthony. And yes, we're just putting hypotheses out there and playing thought experiments. And it feels like we're just scratching the surface. We're at the tip of the iceberg. So hopefully in the parts ahead, we'll be able to come back to these earlier hypotheses and flesh them out even further.
Well, that's right. And if any listeners know of some other podcaster, some other YouTuber who has actually discussed Taylor Swift in a deeply thoughtful and helpful manner, please let us know, because we haven't encountered anyone like that. But it's a big world, and maybe somebody has done that. There's a tremendous amount of analysis of politics and society that goes on in YouTube. Some of it's so detailed and repetitive that it seems almost overdone, but it seems to us like Taylor Swift has been vastly underplayed. And so that in itself is an interesting socio-psychological phenomenon in the human species. Why is it that somebody so important and so salient in the world today has been kind of ignored by the kinds of people who seem deeply curious about the human condition?
Great. Looking forward to the journey ahead on this, Anthony.
Yes, well, to listeners, thank you for joining us today, and please like, subscribe, and share if you really do like the show. And until we see you again here at the BioEdge, it's over and out from us for now.
Cheers.
Cheers.